Few horror movies have had as visceral an impact as 1987's Hellraiser. Directed by author Clive Barker and based on his novella The Hellbound Heart. The story's distinctive blend of imagination, terror, and eroticism has so far spawned 9 sequels of varying quality, as well as a 2015 sequel novel, The Scarlet Gospels. The series' unique aesthetic has struck a chord with fans, and its antagonist, generally referred to as Pinhead, much to Barker's chagrin, has become a horror icon. As a historian and a lifelong horror fan, I'd like to do a deep dive into some of the real historical influences that have helped inspire this classic horror series. If you think that pulling back the curtain and examining those influences would in any way diminish your enjoyment of these movies or these books, you should probably go watch like a cat video or something. Also, it should probably go without saying, but there is a blanket spoiler warning for all of these films and books. Watch at your own risk. That's it. Let's do it.
We have such sights to show you.
First, the requisite personal aside about my own history with these stories. I first encountered Barker's work as a young teenager. I'm not sure exactly which one it was. Probably a short story collection, The Books of Blood. But it absolutely blew my young mind. And if you have not read any of Barker's books before, and you consider yourself a fan of the horror genre, you should absolutely check him out. He is so good. And there's nobody like him just in terms of what he brings to the table, in terms of imagination, creepy, visceral terror. And, he's just an elegant prose stylist as well. He ticks all of those boxes. He is one of the towering giants of modern horror. Do yourself a favor and check him out. In terms of the movies itself, I watched Hellraiser as a kind of cheap dub on a VHS tape off of late night cable with the staticky lines across the picture and stuff like that. But even in such a crappy format, that too blew my mind. It was weird. It was terrifying. It was a little bit horny. And I found it in equal measures attractive and repellent. Over the years, I've checked out the rest of the series as well. And as I said, it's of mixed quality. Some of it is more satisfying than others. The second film, Hellbound, is also really interesting and full of imagination. The Scarlet Gospels, the sequel novel, is also, it's flawed, but there's a lot of cool stuff in there. And the other movies, it really depends. The first 4 are the ones with Barker's direct involvement, and that's mostly what I will focus on in this video. Past a certain point, they even stopped having Doug Bradley as Pinhead, which those movies are generally pretty awful. As of the time I'm recording this video in 2022, there is a Hellraiser remake on the horizon for later this year that is starring a new Pinhead. It's going to have a female actress. I'll give anything a shot, I suppose. We'll see how it's going to be, but I find it hard to imagine anybody but Doug Bradley successfully filling those creepy leather boots. The basic premise behind the Hellraiser stories is that there is a puzzle box, alternately called the Lament configuration or the Le Marchand configuration after its creator. The puzzle box looks a lot like this. This is not, so far as I know, the actual Lament configuration. It's just a replica. The idea is that if you solve the puzzle, you summon the Cenobites, a group of otherworldly beings from an alternate realm. Indeed, it's usually described in the series as hell, who offer sensual experiences beyond the possibilities of earthly existence.
The box. You opened it. We came.
It's just a puzzle box!
Oh no. It is a means to summon us.
Who are you?
Explorers in the further regions of experience. Demons to some. Angels to others.
It was a mistake! I didn't mean to open it! It was a mistake! You can go! Go to hell!
We can't. Not alone. You solved the box. We came. Now you must come with us. Taste our pleasures.
Please, go away and leave me alone!
Oh, no tears, please. It's a waste of good suffering.
The sorts of experiences the Cenobites offer mix pleasure and pain in equal measure, and it's worth noting that they generally are summoned deliberately by an individual solving the puzzle. This is sometimes handled inconsistently throughout the series, but generally the idea is that they are invoked by somebody who is just a little bit bored.
Bored now.
With the sort of kink that they can get on in their daily lives and want something a bit more. And end up generally finding that it's way more than they bargained for. So, like, if you ever see one of these, like, don't solve it unless, like, you're really, really extra horny. Because the Cenobites in the series take it to another level. We'll just put this over here. Since the lament configuration is kind of the initiating object in all of these stories, perhaps the place to begin is to really talk a bit about the history of puzzles like this. Because puzzles have a long pedigree. Maybe the oldest puzzle is the Labyrinth, which uncoincidentally features prominently in Hellraiser. Hell is depicted as a labyrinth in Hellbound, and the Scarlet Gospels also describe hell as having several labyrinths. If we're talking about the lament configuration itself, the puzzle box, we could perhaps reference German burr puzzles, they're often called. This is one, a sort of wooden contraption that can be taken apart and fit back together. I'm not going to do that because, like, I suck at these. But that's, I think, clearly an inspiration, as well as Japanese puzzle boxes. Himitsu Baku, which originated in the 19th century. Barker himself describes the toymaker Philippe Le Marchand as European, but that his creation was reminiscent of, quote, Chinese puzzles. Also, certainly, I think we would be remiss if we did not mention the creation of Erna Rubik, the Rubik's Cube, which took the world by storm during the 1980s.
Warning, once you get your hands on Rubik's Cube, you may never be able to put it down. Rubik's Cube, over 3 billion combinations, but just one solution from Ideal.
Barker never mentions this wholesome, brightly colored creation, which seems a long way from the lament configuration. But I think it kind of strains credibility to believe that this nigh ubiquitous toy, during the decade when Barker was writing, was not at least percolating in his subconscious somewhere when he was creating this story. So, human beings have been fascinated with puzzles and trinkets and stuff like that. But beyond that, obviously, the point of the story is not so much the puzzle, but the sort of kinky, terrifying sexuality that it unleashes. So we have to do perhaps something of an examination of the intertwining of pleasure and pain and the legacy of kind of European philosophical thought. Like, seriously, there are some of those influences in this series as well. To not put too fine a point on it, we're talking about sadomasochism.
I told you I was freaking. I told you I was freaking, baby. You didn't believe me. Don't look at me.
Indeed, Hellraiser's working title was Sadomasochist from Beyond the Grave. Probably a good thing they changed that one. But that label is at least referenced in the Scarlet Gospels as well. It's sort of tongue-in-cheek, but I mean, I think it gets at part of the inspiration of some of these stories. So if we're talking about the label sadomasochism, the sadism part of it comes from an 18th century French dude, Donatien Alphonse Francois, the Marquis de Sade. He was an Enlightenment philosopher, an erotic novelist, and a sexual libertine who spent more than half of his adult life in prison. His works flouted the moral and religious norms of his day and proclaimed a gospel of absolute freedom. His most notable print works included 1785's 120 Days of Sodom and 1791's Justine, all of which celebrate anal sex, erotic violence, suffering, and blasphemy.
Oh my.
That put him at odds with the repressive Catholic culture of the French royal state of his day. That's what landed him in jail. When the French Revolution came along, he was ultimately released, but his ideas were so radical that he was ultimately imprisoned again during Robespierre's reign of terror. Even the French Revolution thought this guy was too much of a kinky freak to be allowed to roam free in society. So Sade's ideas were extreme and shocking in his own day, and to a certain extent, they still are. His work has influenced such diverse cultural figures as Charles Baudelaire, Guillaume Apollinaire, Michel Foucault, and John Waters. He's also explicitly referenced in The Hellbound Heart. Barker mentions both Sade and the 120 Days of Sodom, and probably he is at least a partial inspiration for the Duc de Lille in the fourth movie, Hellraiser Bloodline, which goes into the origins of the Lament configuration, and he's a sort of creepy French aristocrat, libertine, and magician who commissions the construction of the puzzle box for the first time.
Fear not, Jacques, remember your lessons. A summoned demon is yours to command.
Unless you stand in hell's way.
Yes. He who summons the magic commands the magic.
Also worth noting that in this movie, Delille's servant Jacques, who ultimately betrays him, steals the puzzle box, and enslaves the demonic princess from hell, Angelique, is played by Adam Scott of Parks and Recreation in one of his first film roles, which sort of makes you wonder what exactly is going on with the Cones of Dunshire. Does it summon kinky demons from hell?
Presenting the Cones of Dunshire, a brand new gaming experience. Are the cones a metaphor? Well, yes and no.
The masochism portion of the label comes from Leopold von Sacher-Masoch. He was born in the 19th century in Habsburg Galicia, in what is now Western Ukraine, and was a folklorist, a socialist, and a writer who is best known for his 1870 novella Venus and Furs, which celebrates sexual humiliation and female dominance. And taken together, these guys give the label to sadomasochism. Sade's name connoting the sexual thrill at inflicting pain, while Masoch the thrill in receiving it. The first person to sort of combine these labels and to talk about this particular sort of kink as a human phenomenon was the German psychiatrist Richard von Krafft-Ebing. The interest in studying these sorts of sexual tendencies was picked up by the much better known founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud. His investigation of sexualities, which he termed aberrant, were set out in his 1905 work, Drei Abhandlungen zur Sexualtheorie, 3 papers on sexual theory. And I suppose while we're talking about European philosophers who focused on kinky stuff like this, in The Hellbound Heart, Barker also explicitly references the French occultist and mass murderer of children, Gilles de Rais, as well as the Jacobite English anti-religious philosopher Henry St. John, the first Vicomte Bolingbroke, who influenced Enlightenment philosophers such as Voltaire, Holbach, Jefferson, and Adams. He also mentions Aleister Crowley, the English occultist and self-styled magician who made ample use of satanic imagery and who advocated total liberation, prominently defending bi and homosexual activity at a time when they were very much still taboo in turn of the 20th century Britain. Crowley's libertine rejection of bourgeois morality in favor of an adventurous and exploratory conception of sexuality bears a striking resemblance to those who seek out the lament configuration in the Hellraiser series. Psychologists continue to debate the extent to which the giving and receiving of pain might or might not be part of a healthy conception of sexuality. By the latter decades of the 20th century, however, practitioners had produced what came to be known as BDSM, which refers to bondage and discipline, domination and submission, and sadism and masochism. The BDSM subculture has historically been closely associated with certain aspects of gay culture, and in particular the leather community, which blended sadomasochism with the biker aesthetic and the image of Marlon Brando in 1953's The Wild One. By the time of the 1973 pornographic film Nights in Black Leather and the inauguration of the Easter in Berlin Festival in 1975, BDSM was firmly a part of gay sexual culture. And indeed, Barker himself has mentioned that he for a time worked as a gay prostitute to make ends meet as a young man. When it came time to direct Hellraiser years later, he gave the costume designer copies of the underground publication Piercing Fans International Quarterly and gave her the explicit instruction to make the Cenobites look like, quote, magnificent super butches. Themes from BDSM subculture also recur in the Scarlet Gospels, where the protagonist Harry Lamore investigates a house full of BDSM-themed sex toys and furniture before finding the lament configuration and summoning Pinhead. And later scenes take place in an abandoned S&M club. So clearly, the DNA of BDSM culture is embedded throughout the Hellraiser films. That stuff is definitely a part of it. And so too is the rejection of traditional authority, particularly religious authority. Pinhead and his posse are deliberately set up as an infernal parody of Catholic religious orders. The label Cenobites derives from Cenobitic monks, believers dedicated to a particular set of ideals who live together in a community.
A demon to some and an angel to others, like a Cenobite.
Excuse me, did you say Cenobite?
Yeah, you know Cenobite, like from Hellraiser.
You like Hellraiser. You know the word Hellraiser.
I thought Pinhead in space was a bit of a letdown, but I'm in for the ride.
Saint Benedict of Nursia, the 6th century founder of the Benedictine order, helped make Cenobitic monasticism an extremely successful model for medieval Catholicism. Indeed, worth noting, Barker's preferred label for Pinhead is the Hell Priest. Pinhead was actually a nickname coined by one of the film production crew. It was never anything that Barker intended for this character to be called. And during the Scarlet Gospels, it's continually brought up as kind of a recurring joke that it really annoys Pinhead when anybody calls him this. The preferred label is the Hell Priest, which makes the parallels with Catholicism and the kind of dark mirror it holds up to Catholic Church hierarchy even more explicit. Really, Pinhead and the Cenobites are just a bunch of BDSM hellmonks. And when the church itself is referenced, it doesn't come off terribly well. In the Scarlet Gospels, Barker describes Lamore's Catholic education at St. Dominic's School for Boys, where students were sexually assaulted by the priests. Lamore hates the smell of old books because he was raped by Father Edgar in the library. Given that over the course of the past 3 decades, nearly 400 Catholic priests all over the world have been accused of sexually assaulting more than 10,000 children, this portrayal is unfortunately anything but fanciful. This backdrop brings a certain sense of satisfaction to the scene in the 3rd Hellraiser movie, Hell on Earth, where Pinhead profanes a Catholic church and its priest with his mockery of Christ's passion and the sacrament of the Eucharist.
You'll burn in hell for this!
Bird of such a limited imagination. This is my body. This is my blood. Happy are they who come to my supper.
And this is one of those movies that, like, the over-the-top portrayal of Pinhead is far more a kind of grand guignol, Freddy Krueger-esque kind of quippy version of the character, as opposed to the more restrained and kind of sophisticated version from the first couple of movies. But at least with this scene, you can definitely get where some of the anger is coming from here. And if we're talking about pushing back against traditional authority figures, we should also obviously reference the psychiatrist Dr. Chenard from the second movie, who is portrayed as amoral and sadistic and willing to sacrifice his patients' welfare for his own interests, perhaps echoing Foucault's critique of the pathologizing and othering aspects of mental health treatment since the Enlightenment. That perhaps brings us around to one other distinctive notion of these movies, which is that the horror genre as a whole can often be fairly reactionary. Too often, horror offers sadistic punishments to those people, particularly horny teenagers, who dare to transgress established social norms. Rather than that, Hellraiser celebrates rebellion in an active sense.
For God's sake. Do I look like someone who cares what God thinks?
As Barker himself stated, quote, "Horror fictions tends to be reactionary. It's usually about a return to the status quo. The monster is the outsider who must be banished from the sanctum. But over and over again, I've created monsters who come from the outside and who call out to somebody to join them in the sanctum." That's certainly true of Pinhead, who, according to Hellraiser 3, began his existence as the human Elliot Spencer, a World War I veteran, who, like so many of his generation, was disillusioned and nearly destroyed by his experiences. Some drank themselves to death, but Spencer, as the movie said, went further, rebelling against the norms of his society by pursuing the extremes of experience, transformed in the process into the Hell Priest. Though their portrayal in the series is often inconsistent, that is the basic take on the rest of the Cenobites as well, that they were people who deliberately sought out experiences beyond the norm and were transformed by those desires. And indeed, it's not entirely clear that the Cenobites are the bad guys in any conventional sense. They simply give those who seek them out what they want, or at least what they think they want.
It is not hands that call us. It is desire.
It's not really their fault that these experiences end up going further than those who summon them expected in the first place. This restless sense of rebellion describes the character of Frank in the first movie, as well as Julia, who is characterized as, quote, the perfect hausfrau, polite, upright, and rigid. Rather than accept a straight-laced conventional existence as a bourgeois housewife, Julia rebels and becomes a murderer to restore her damned lover to carnal physicality. And indeed, perhaps the ultimate rebel in the canon of Western thought, Lucifer makes an appearance in the Scarlet Gospel,